Americans who have lived abroad, biggest reverse culture shock upon returning to the US. Story 1, return to the US from Korea. It gets talked about all the time, but just how unnecessarily complicated and inconvenient our healthcare system is. To go from a system where you can go see a doctor, a specialist any day of the week without an appointment, to know you will be covered and to have the peace of mind that you'll spend probably less than $20, to then go to whatever we have here. It's just absurd to me. I also pay twice for my healthcare here than I did in Korea. We are so duped for a system that is openly robbing us and not keeping us well. Story 2. The scam that is the for-profit healthcare system in the US. Truly pathetic that the richest country in human history can't provide universal coverage for all its citizens. Medical bills, medical debt, insurers deciding which procedures you really need, doctors and hospitals being in, out of the network, all foreign concepts to most developed countries. We talk a lot about freedom in the US, but it's usually about positive freedoms, i.e., the freedom to own a gun. But we forget about negative freedoms, the freedom from something, such as medical debt, student debt, etc. In that sense, we lack many basic freedoms enjoyed by other countries. Story 3. The food. Lived in Canada from 2006 to 2014. You don't really notice it going the other way, but coming back, holy crap, everything is loaded with salt and sugar. Everything. It is jarring. I gained over 20 pounds my first year back. I get that people do not want to hear this because we all love our dino nuggets and cheap frozen pizza, but damn, they really are trying to kill us with our food. At the very least, they truly do not care if they kill us so long as the profit margins are high. Related to that, the sheer number of truly obese people. Kids, in particular. I lived in Toronto, and it was incredibly rare to see a person who clearly weighed over 300 pounds. Like maybe once a year. Coming back, it was just shocking how big the average American had become. I pretty much lay that at the feet of the food thing. Story 4. I lived in Japan for a year. Coming back to the States made me realize how dirty it is here, and people are lazy and disrespectful when it comes to taking care of the city and each other. In Japan, it's a collective effort. Public restrooms are clean. If you have trash, you put it in your pocket or purse and hold on to it until you can find access to a trash can. Here, people will drop it on the ground because they cannot dare to be inconvenienced. I've seen people at stoplights open their door and leave bags of McDonald's trash on the street and drive off so they can have a clean car. Of course, one of the first public restroom experiences when I came back home was in a store where there was a drainage grate in the floor, and a woman had her kid taking a piss in the grates instead of the toilet. And don't get me started on how if they even have the sniffles, they wear a mask in public to be courteous, but here people like to cough directly into the wind. Story 5, I grew up in the US but have spent my whole adult life in the UK and Austria. There are so many unique or nearly unique things about the US. Everything in the US is huge. I'm in the US this week and just visited a friend in Chicago. She was apologizing for a cramped flat, but it was palatial by middle-class Western Euro standards. Only thing we've got on Americans in that department is super high ceilings. It applies to food too, of course. I just saw a pack of Reese's cups at Target that was more than a meter high. Diabolical. Lots of stuff is super sweet when it shouldn't be. Coffee, bread, sauces. It's kind of icky once you start noticing it. Especially in Austria, shops and offices have very limited hours by comparison. I forget this sometimes and find myself planning around not being able to get anything on Sundays. Tip culture as it is in the States wouldn't be tolerated in Austria. The UK is slightly closer to the American model, but not much. They're quite forward in asking for it. It should of course be given, but it ought to be presented like a choice in my opinion. No guns signs on business doors. That's a stark reminder when you've been away. This probably runs counter to the common narrative, but I find lots of Americans are quite rude in that they're not really aware of other people around them. Flying in this week, I was shocked by the fact that people just splay their stuff out on an escalator and block the path. You're supposed to stand on the right side and leave the left lane open for people in a hurry. There's also stuff like playing music out loud on buses and trains. This happens everywhere, but seems more common in the US. The amount of space given over to cars. There are so many parking garages, it's a ridiculous waste of space, and they're invariably ugly as sin. We have them in Europe, but not as many, and at least in the big cities, they're generally subterranean. Story 6, I lived in Egypt for 3 years. My son was born in Egypt. I spent most of the pandemic in Egypt. I feel lucky to have been there because it wasn't as bad there as in America. Navigating the bureaucracy to get his birth certificate and extend our visa was an incredible exercise in patience. They don't have hardly any computers in the offices, and everyone is smoking or having tea. You have to have wasta to get anything done. I also lived in Russia for a little more than a year, until just after the Ukraine war started. Watching Russia roll out its Z campaign in real time was weird. 21st century Russian fascism was fascinating and kind of terrifying. All that said, coming back to the US has been a challenge. I feel lonely as hell. Everything is so expensive. I have to drive literally everywhere. I just feel so depressed since coming home. My heart hurts for the Egyptian people. It's hard times there with corruption, inflation, and currency collapse, military dictatorship stealing from people, etc. Still, I want to go back. I miss it so much. Story 7. Something I realized back in the 2000s when talking to people was that the general education was on a lower level than, say, that of most European countries. Even things like college that people pride themselves on. I often found the foundations in understanding can be a bit detached and rudimentary in the US as compared with Europe. I left the US as a kid in the 80s, and when I started schooling at around 5 years in another country in Europe, I was reading a book a day and writing endless pages of flowing cursive/shorthand script to get in as much deliberations and info as possible to the teachers, as that was usually what's expected of kids back then. I compare my schooling to some of my relatives who remained in the US, and it's like they never learned how to read or write very well despite being able to get a college degree. I found that when people are trying to read aloud, it seems like they aren't reading as much as trying to decode the letter combinations in real time, so they stumble over the words repeatedly as if some foundational line of code was deleted by accident. They also don't seem to understand basic things like geography and natural systems such as the water cycle, the interactions of the different types of resources in an economy, and so on. It seems like a lot of people just think that there's an infinite amount of resources and space out there, so there's less concern around things like resource and waste management. I think most of that comes from a low regard for schooling and intellectual activity in general, despite being willing to toss a lot of money into the system. Then there's also things like homeschooling and religious schooling into the mix. The very individualistic nature of the country allows people to live entirely detached from the rest of society and remain very shielded inside their own bubble. Oftentimes, when talking with a stranger, you can't expect there to be a shared sense of reality, leading to a lot of situations where what's considered normal behavior would elsewhere in the world be thought of as a rare occurrence of someone who's escaped a mental institution. Also, the kind of arrogance that comes with a culture of empire makes people overly confident of their situation and abilities, which is reminiscent of Britain and their colonial attitudes before the disintegration. What you'll actually find is that a lot of people will just crumble in the face of novel situations and difficulties. And so it's not the case anymore that there's a lot of brave and inventive, educated people out there who will take on any sort of new challenge. Part of that could be remedied if people were actually able to learn what's going on in other places in the world and not just project their assumptions upon everything they see. Instead, it's a case of people shadowboxing with these assumptions and keep running into walls where it actually clashes with reality. I think that's going to be the main issue in the future, which is that the expertise may not be there to keep the US running as it has been. A lot of early science education in particular was catapulted in response to the Soviet space military program. My family initially worked in the early computer industry on the west coast of the US. That was a byproduct of a lot of research connected to that, before we happened to settle down in Europe because of a job opportunity due to having experience in these new industries and fields. Story 8 was stationed in South Korea for 2 years at the end of my term. Was a culture shock going into it, definitely. Kind of wanted to stay on base more than I wanted to explore for the first few months I was there. But then once I started getting sick of being on base, I started to explore and really fell into the gaming community that South Korea offers. I barely spoke Korean, and even now have a low understanding of it. But people overwhelmingly communicated with me in English when they wanted to. For the most part, South Koreans were nice to me, but there was still a lot of hate for not only being a white guy, but also being a US soldier. So coming back to Southwest Virginia after leaving the military, I felt like I was frozen in time. People weren't right on top of me, involved in my life, no structure from the military. Not only did I leave the military, but I left another country entirely, where I lived in a very populated city, where I had found genuine interests and even appreciated my surroundings when I was clearly not welcomed more often than not. Coming home, I have never felt more lonely in my life. Friends had moved on and weren't really friends anymore, just acquaintances. Parents and family were welcoming but distant. Went into big-time depression. I knew I was depressed, but looking back, that depression lasted for years. Just didn't realize it at the time, and I still don't think I'm as happy as I was in the military in South Korea a decade later. I think people should visit and explore the world, but if you move away to a different country, coming back is going to be hell. The US may not seem like it has a culture, but it does, and it's not even remotely close to a community-based culture. I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just that some cultures may fit your personality a lot better, and experiencing that, then losing it, will hurt your soul. Story 9, I spent 15 years on overseas assignments in Australia, Japan, China, Singapore, and last stint in Bangkok from 2003 to 2018. Came back for quarterly business reviews and visiting family. The biggest thing for me was noticing how much of a fiasco news on TV became when I got back to the US on both sides of the fence. I had to stop watching the news altogether to maintain sanity. Nachos are better in the US. Singapore had a special different way of messing them up for each different so-called Mexican restaurant. The one exception was Cafe Iguana in the Riverside area of Singapore. They got it close except for the lettuce they would put on top of the nachos. Overall, the version of Mexican food available in the US is much better in the US than pretty much anywhere in the world, except for Mexico. Their Mexican food is fantastic. Drink refills at restaurants. Tipping in the US. I got back to the US about 18 months before COVID. During COVID and after, my feeling is tipping has gotten way out of hand in the US. Now I have to tip every friggin' body I see? No way, not doing it. I've been tipping 20% in the US since before I went overseas. Tipping to traditional tipping positions. But now kids that make $16 per hour in the sandwich shop in San Diego have that damn iPad, with 20% being the lowest choice. No. The biggest difference? Healthcare. Every country above where I lived, with work permits, paying taxes, etc., I did not have to worry one bit about healthcare. I did not worry that if something catastrophic happened, that I would become destitute from medical bills. The cost and billing practices I encountered when I did need medical care were reasonable. Not so much in the US. In the US, if something goes wrong and I'm in the wrong place and by force have to deal with out-of-network, I'd be shit out of luck. The insurance I have now with an employer, that's not the case, but when I had to get insurance on my own via ACA, an out-of-network emergency was pretty much on your own. Appreciation for what we do have in the US. I spent time in the countries listed above as my base of operations, but I traveled all over the region: Australia, New Zealand, China, Korea, Japan, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Pakistan. There are good and bad in each. But overall, there is a reason why there is a net influx of people into the US rather than leaving. There are opportunities here that many people don't have in their home countries. After living overseas for 15 years, except for the healthcare situation, my favorite place on the planet is San Diego, California. Story 10. I moved to Canada 15 years ago, and even though it's culturally close, there are reliable culture shock differences I notice every time I visit family in the US. One is that Americans will start random conversations with strangers in public places like grocery stores and sidewalks. Canadians generally do not do this, and may even consider a stranger talking to them to be rude. I am more introverted and prefer the Canadian attitude, but I can understand how more extroverted people consider Americans to be more friendly in public. It is sort of fake, but can be pleasant. Another thing is that American TV advertisements are more extreme and comical. This has actually accelerated since I left the country. When I watch American TV, I'm shocked how loud and frenetic the humor and voices are in the advertisements. When Americans leave the TV on in the house, which they often do, I find it almost impossible to have a conversation or feel relaxed. There are lots of other little things like this, but there's a lot of suburbia in Canada, so unlike culture shock from Europe or Asia, that's less of a thing you notice in comparison to Canada.